to this show, and we've had you on many occasions. Yeah. And I think the topic that we're going to talk about this morning having to do with policing and the impact upon how people are policed, the impact that it has upon race relations in America. And so let's have you to start us off by taking the first few minutes to say something about LBaldwin.
Okay.
Give us some information about your background, your education, and some of your experiences, and then we'll go into that second segment dealing with the status of Africans during certain periods.
Yes. I grew up in Wilcox County, Alabama, which is known as the Alabama Black Belt, in the late 1940s, the 50s, and the 60s. And I was very much exposed at that time to law enforcement, black community relations. I attended the segregated public schools in Wilcox County, Alabama, Camden, Alabama. I was educated at Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama, and also at Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York. And I received a PhD in American Christianity at Northwestern University in 1980, and of course since that time I've been teaching. I've taught at Worcester College in Ohio, Colgate University in New York, Colgate Rochester Divinity School in Rochester, New York, and also Vanderbilt University. Also taught courses at Fisk University and American Baptist College. During much of my career, I've studied the life of Dr. King, have produced scholarship on the life of Dr. King and his involvement with the civil rights movement. And I'm very interested as an educator in translating what I do in the classroom into what goes on in everyday life in communities. I retired after 30 years in the Department of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University in 2013. So 3 years ago I retired, but I continue to write about Dr. King and to talk about the role of religion in transforming the American society.
You know, Dr. Baldwin, you've got, excuse me, so much information, and you've written so much about the African American experience and et cetera, that the topic that we have to talk about this morning really takes you way back into the experience of Americans, of the United States of America. That is policing and the African American and et cetera. Let's look at it from that perspective and have you talk about as you see policing during certain periods.
I've always said that we need to see this in a larger historical context. We have to understand that the problems that exist between the black communities and law enforcement didn't start with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, 2 years ago. It actually started with the coming of blacks to America. If you study, and I've done so in my research, looked at newspaper accounts in the 18th and 19th century, you will notice that there were always problems between black communities and constables and sheriffs and other representatives of law enforcement. So those problems go back to 1619 when we first came to this country, and they extend through the 18th and 19th centuries. When you look at the early 20th centuries, many of the riots that were going on in Illinois and other parts of the North and in parts of the South, Atlanta in 1906, you will notice that there were always problems between the black community and law enforcement. There was always the sense that representatives of law enforcement were combining or joining or uniting with elements of the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council. That was understood in the early part of the 20th century. If you look at the 1950s and 60s, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X talked a lot about how KKK elements and other white supremacist groups were collaborating with police departments in the subjugation, subordination of blacks. So we're talking about a historical issue.
And so what we'll do, Dr. Baldwin, we're going to take this first commercial break, and then we'll get back, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome to the second segment of the show this morning. We're talking to Dr. Louis Baldwin, and the topic is policing and the status of declining status of race in America. Now, Dr. Baldwin, before we had our first commercial break, you were talking about policing in the period during the war, I mean before the Civil War. But let's pick up, and let's allow you at your own discretion to pick up where you think is necessary so that we might be able to demonstrate the kind of things that happen between the police and the African over the periods of time that brings us up to
Yes. My point in the first segment of the show was to indicate that we have to look at this in a larger historical context, and to see that what's going on today in terms of police, African-American community relations, didn't start with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. There's a long history of tension, of antagonistic relations, of strained relations between the black community and the police. What we see today, of course, is a building on that kind of legacy. It's a product of that legacy. When Michael Brown was killed in Missouri in 2014, many in our society, particularly in the black community, felt that it was a continuation of that, what had happened in 1955 with the killing of Emmett Till. And of course we saw Tamir Rice in Cleveland killed, Freddie Gray in Baltimore. So what we see today is a tragic part of that legacy of strained and tense relations between law enforcement and the black community. Interestingly enough, it has to do with, I think, a lot of things. First of all, I think, is that in this culture, in this history of this society, there's long been this view that blacks are somehow or another genetically predisposed to criminology. And that was certainly the view in the 18th and 19th centuries. And unfortunately, we're dealing with remnants of that in the 20th. We dealt with remnants of it in the 20th century and in the 21st century. So we are still dealing with strained relations, antagonistic relations between the black community and law enforcement. And the challenge, of course, has to do with how we overcome this long history, how we overcome this legacy of antagonistic and strained and tense relations between the African-American community and the police.
Now that's a real question, Dr. Baldwin, and I think all of us are aware of this tension and the antagonism, but now the question that you raised is how do we overcome such things, and let's see if you can answer that for us.
Yes.
I think that's crucial, because I think that no matter what period we're dealing with, the ability to be able to overcome it ought to be the same. In many instances.
Martin Luther King Jr. taught us that violence creates violence, or violence leads to violence. And what we are seeing today, of course, is not only violence against police. We saw that in Dallas a couple of weeks ago with the alleged shooter, Michael Xavier Johnson. We saw that in Baton Rouge with the alleged shooter, Gavin Long. And we've also seen police misconduct and police violence against blacks. The killing of Philando Castile in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the killing of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge. So what we are seeing today is this cycle of violence, not only on the side of the police, but also the African American community. So what we have to do is to try and come up with solutions that benefit both sides. And we have people on both sides of the spectrum today. There are those who say that the police are victims, and there are those who say that the African American community is victimized by this kind. But I think on both sides you find people who are victimized. So we have to come up with a voice of reason, a voice of objectivity that gives us solutions for both sides of the equation. And so far we have not come up with that.
And some people actually want to turn the clock back to earlier periods in terms of how Africans were treated and et cetera. And I think one of the real issues too is that the more freedom in a real sense, you know, when we started out as slaves, you know, we had no freedom. And so anybody outside of the slave community had the responsibility of what? Keeping Africans in their place. But as we move from one period to another, and then the 13th, 14th, and 15th, all of these amendments, but it really didn't change too many attitudes in reference to the overwhelming majority of attitudes that most whites had toward African Americans.
And we see that during the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and other voices of the civil. They spoke out against police brutality. They spoke out against racial profiling, and they also called for more justice in the criminal justice system. So we're talking about a historic problem that we need to look at it in this larger historical context if we're going to address it. And I think that's very, very important. When many of us look at what's going on today with policing in the black community, we tend to look at it in a contemporary historical context or contemporary context. But we need to have more of a larger historical view of what's going on.
And have people understand that. As a matter of fact, I think that if we can create some, I guess we've created all the forums and all of the activities that we might need in terms of trying to bring about better race relations. But there has to be something that we can do, and there ought to be places for people of goodwill on both sides, African as well as the police department, to create that kind of goodwill.
Yes, and we need all institutions involved. We need religious institutions, churches, synagogues, mosques involved. We need fraternal orders of police involved. We need politicians involved, federal government involved, to create what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called a kind of coalition of conscience. And if we have that kind of coalition of conscience, people from all sides coming at this issue, then I'm sure that we can come up with some solutions to the problems that divide. And what we're talking about is a divide between law enforcement and African American communities.
And I think that when we look back over the history of that relationship, we can say in a real sense that we've come a long way. You know, because we don't have the hang-ins and et cetera that we used to have. But there's still a long way to go. But we have to understand that we've been able to overcome many of these things.
Because when I was a boy, when we saw policemen, we felt that they were the same as the Klan.
And so I think we're going to have a break, and then we're going to come back and continue this. We'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Sorry, I missed. Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and the topic is police and the decline in status of race in America. And so, Dr. Baldwin, over the last 10 minutes that we have here, let's give you an opportunity to sort of summarize, in a real sense, some of the things that can be done in such a way that we can leave with our audience this morning what they can find and pick out among these options, what they can do in order to help the whole situation.
Yes, I think we would agree that we are at a critical point in this nation's history. This is 2016, and we're still dealing with antagonistic and tense relations between the black community and law enforcement. What we need, first and foremost, are voices of reason and objectivity. We need voices like President Barack Obama. And President Barack Obama, of course, is walking a tightrope because he's trying to show, I think successfully, that he supports law enforcement, that he understands that without law enforcement, we live in a society characterized by anarchy and lawlessness. But he's also speaking to the issue of police misconduct and the killing of black men. So we need those kinds of voices. Unfortunately, we aren't getting many of those. On the right, the political right, we hear many who are critiquing Black Lives Matter, who are critiquing President Obama, and in many ways blaming them for the problems that we encounter in terms of the relations between law enforcement and black communities. But they are trying to come up with solutions. And I think we need to understand that we have to move in 4 directions. First of all, we have to emphasize the importance of education. And education is very, very important, as Dr. King taught us, and as a King scholar, I would recommend that, is that you change the mind, you enlighten the minds of people when it comes to education. Religion is important in terms of changing the hearts of people. Then you need legislation and court action, of course, the kind of laws that will respect the dignity and worth of all human personality, not simply policemen, but also African Americans and people of other ethnic and racial backgrounds, and finally, nonviolent direct action. Now, one of the groups that I see today that embodies all of these approaches to the problem, of course, is Black Lives Matter. They're very much concerned with nonviolent approaches to dealing with the issues of not only racial profiling, police brutality, but also inequality in the criminal justice system. And I think we got to deal with all of these issues if we're going to solve the problem. We've seen over the last couple of weeks not only the killing of Philando Castile out in St. Paul, the killing of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, but we've seen the killing of police officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge. And we need to understand that we aren't going to solve these problems that exist between the black community and law enforcement until we take this fourfold approach: education that changes the mind, a religion that changes the heart. And you recall when President Obama eulogized those 5 policemen in Dallas, he talked about the need for a new heart. Dr. King talked about that in 1968, that we need a new heart. Okay, so you not only change and enlighten the mind, you change the hearts of people. You also work through court action and legislation, laws to make sure that people's rights are respected. Not only people you don't want to set up a double standard of justice, one for police and one for citizens. It means that all people, the rights, the life, the liberty, the dignity and worth of personality of all people should be respected. And finally, nonviolent direct action. And I see Black Lives Matter as engaging in these kinds of approaches today in order to improve black community relations with law enforcement.
You know, one of the things that I think you'll notice, Dr. Baldwin, and you've probably heard people make some statements in reference to it, is that Black Lives Matter has been maligned by many people.
Exactly.
And I think that we see that organization as trying to accomplish exactly what you laid out there.
Exactly.
That they are, in a real sense, instead of trying to create a problem, they're trying to deal with a problem, solve a problem.
Exactly. We need to keep in mind that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was accused of creating problems. He was accused of initiating violence. But what he was concerned about was what? Eliminating violence and bringing about goodwill and cooperation between peoples of different racial, ethnic, and political, religious backgrounds. And if you look at the Black Lives Matter, it's not a black movement. It's a movement made up of blacks, of whites, of LGBT people, from the lesbian, gay, transgender communities, people of different religious backgrounds. They are coming together to fight for equal rights, for justice, not only for people in the police department, but for people in our local communities. And they understand that if you're going to resolve this problem, you need people who speak with the voices of reason and objectivity. And you don't see a lot of that on the extreme right. You don't see a lot of it on the extreme left.
And so, in a real sense, if we could all get behind some idea in terms of trying to bring about better relationships between the police departments and the African American community or minority communities, or the police department and other communities, because African Americans and others
Black
are
and
not
brown.
the only. All of us are affected by this, and if we think in terms of trying to bring about a better relationship and each person commits himself or herself to that idea, you think we might be able to accomplish something?
I think we will, and I would add that the upcoming presidential election in November 2016 will have a great impact on whether or not we're able to translate certain kinds of ideals and values into a system that is beneficial to both black communities or minority communities and the police or law enforcement. Because we need a society in which the rights, the dignity, and worth of all people,
persons. I agree with that.
Are respected.
That's exactly it.
And I read recently where there is an effort in Tennessee to come up with a Blue Lives Matter law, which increases the penalty for the abuse and the killing of police. We need that for all Americans. We don't want to give the impression that we're setting up a double standard of justice in America, and too many of us give that impression. We need a standard of justice that benefits all citizens, that recognizes that people in law enforcement are like the rest of us. They are not above the law. They must conform very much to the values, the standards, the laws embodied in the Constitution, just like the rest of us.
And you know, Dr. Baldwin, I might be too optimistic in reference to this, but I think that as a historian, you've had an opportunity to see race relations from slavery up until now. And we know that there were atrocities that were committed during these earlier periods up until now, that there would be nothing like that today, etc. And so we overcame lynching.
That's right.
We overcame burning.
That's right.
And we overcame all of these things. And in many instances, when we overcame them, the law was often involved with that. I think you mentioned Emmett Till. Well, the law was involved with that.
That's right. You can't engage in those kinds of practices anymore, lynchings and burnings. And so we need to understand this whole issue in a larger historical context and come up with solutions that involve not only our religious institutions, but our orders of police around the country, fraternal orders of police, federal government. And I think we can solve this problem. Otherwise, as Dr. King pointed out, if we don't learn to live together as brothers and sisters, we will perish together as fools.
And I'm optimistic, Dr. Baldwin, that things will get better. We overcame a lot up until this point, and so we're just moving forward in hopes of making things better. And of course, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.